As such, a minority rule that uses the age-old method of dividing and ruling might be the best deal we can get at a time when no clear unity is yet in sight. The division process then consists more of balancing an already existing division than in breaking up any sort of unity. It might be the only thing that keeps us from descending into a world of true barbarism and brutality like we haven't seen it since the end of the Roman Empire. Hello and welcome to the second episode of Building Blocks of Society. Today I would like to talk about a term that sounds almost as fancy as the negation of the negation, but that is much more commonly known. It is divide et impera, best known in its translation as divide and conquer, but also in the translation that I want to talk about today, divide and rule. You see, when I placed the negation of the negation as my first building block, I found it to be a fitting topic to begin with, as one of the lessons to be learned from that principle was, simply speaking, to always consider the other side of the argument as well. Things are never one-dimensional, and we're killing any prospect of debate, development, and ultimately synthesis if we assume that the other side is just one-dimensional, likely mean-spirited, and perhaps a bit stupid. When I started work on my divide et impera script, my original approach was to develop a straightforward critique of it, as the knee-jerk reaction we all have when being confronted with it on a daily basis is to shake our head in dismay and to state knowingly that it's a typical example of divide et impera. It all seems very critical, but honestly speaking, it is not a very thorough criticism. My script has since evolved into something that hopefully adds a little more to the topic than obvious commonplace criticism. Also, it should be pointed out that this is a potentially vast topic and that I do not attempt to cover it in all aspects of its complexity. The issues discussed are a selection of points I find important to discuss right now. Maybe I will revisit this topic in the future and add to it, but for now, let's dive right into it. As I mentioned, today I want to focus solely on exploring the term divide and rule as it applies to the inner workings of our societies. So, no advice for generals trying to conquer other nations. This is purely about the way our societies are being organized internally. I'm also going to cut the history lessons about where the term comes from. You can easily read that up on Wikipedia. No need to have me repeat what's there and pass it off as my own ideas. Divide and rule, as a principle, has been around almost forever. It has been shaping our society for centuries and throughout many different cultures, so that it can almost be seen as an inherent part of how humans organize their societies. The concept of creating division to maintain rule is very old and can be found in all ancient civilizations. Wherever hierarchies develop, sooner or later natural tensions arise between those on top of the hierarchy and those wanting to move up, even if everyone agrees on the necessity of said hierarchy. It is a constant struggle that actually takes up a lot of the energy of the ruling classes, but that seems to be an inevitable part of the game. Not only that, dare I say, it is part of the driving force that brings societal development about. The question is, how many people actually participate in that game? And that is the point that changes throughout history, even though not in a linear fashion. And that is why there are different paint jobs of divide and rule that we know of. By definition, divide and rule is a concept tied to a minority rule. An actual majority rule would have no need to divide the opposition in such a way. Let's not forget that even the fabled Greek democracy was only available to free male citizens of Athens, which is a larger portion of society than an absolute emperor and the bureaucracy surrounding him, but a far cry from a majority that would literally include all people. In fact, it might be worthwhile to ask ourselves the question, if not all rule is ultimately some form of minority rule, and that the best we can hope for would be a confluence of interests of that minority and a major part of society. Actually, most golden ages in history seem to have been results of exactly such a confluence of interests. Obviously, there are differences of how exactly divide and rule works depending on the form of government of a society. The biggest part of the political balancing act is almost always located within the inner circles of a ruling class, whether it is the aristocracy surrounding Louis XIV in Versailles, the tightly woven bureaucracy in the Chinese Empire, the apparatus of the Bolsheviki in the Soviet Union, or what is nowadays referred to as the deep state in the Western nations. In all of these situations, there are conflicts of interest that need to be somehow resolved to be able to rule effectively. In case of majority support, that becomes easy, but when things are divided, they need to be organized in such a way that the division doesn't bring all progress to a halt, but instead keeps itself distracted from interfering from actual decision making. As these conflicts take place mostly within the ruling minority and its direct surroundings, there's very little need to dress it up for the outside world. There is, however, almost always a heavily regulated and codified language and behavioral codex which needs to be adhered to, whether it's the usage of the correct propagandistic phrases in a communist party, or the complex court ceremonial of medieval Chinese court life, or even the forms of etiquette developed in Western culture over the centuries. This turns out to be an important part of keeping order and internal chaos from erupting, even though it is often accompanied by draconic punishments for negligence. This setup changes, or should I say, expands, once the perceived process of decision-making is brought forth from behind closed doors and enters the outside world. In other words, once modern democracy happens. By including regular people in at least a part of the decision-making process, they too become increasingly susceptible to being targeted by divide and rule politics. The popular opinion becomes a battlefield on which the legitimacy of the actual political progress is being fought over. It is important to understand, though, that an actual victory on that battlefield isn't always the goal, nor is it always possible. It's not called convince and rule, and there's a reason for that. The division of a majority is integral to maintaining the independence of minority rulership. But the main challenge lies in maintaining that division in an equilibrium that prevents society from tipping over in a direction that is unfavorable to the minority rule. Even in those instances where the interests of a minority and a majority coincide, minority rulership wants to still remain independent from majority opinion, as the interests might drift apart again at a moment's notice. Throughout history, many forms of division have existed, but in the 20th and 21st century, a binary division of society has increasingly become the most widespread kind of division. This binary division of a society into two seemingly opposing factions can easily be witnessed in many examples, for instance in the democratic system of the United States of America that has been divided into Democrats and Republicans, or the way society is being split in left-wing and right-wing camps, or even whether you prefer Benedict or Francis as a pope. Each side not only gets a team to root for, more importantly yet, they also get a nemesis to fight against. Suddenly, there is structure, hope and purpose for the people affected by it. We start living in hope of impeaching a president or in expectation of the next papacy, and by combating our enemies in whatever form we feel we've done our part. This is also the reason why the pendulum between those sides needs to swing back and forth, at least for some time, because if one side only keeps losing, malcontent rises exponentially and people will be fed up with that game. The possibility of the malcontents throwing a tantrum and overthrowing society as we know it would become a real threat, and so it's necessary to give each side the feeling that they could win which is best achieved by simply letting them win from time to time, even if those wins have disappointingly little influence on actual politics. What diplomats and lobbyists are for the inner circles of power, the media and its cohorts are for the outside world. Enablers. By enablers, I mean a power that enables actual rulership to happen by keeping society divided. The media has been fulfilling this function for centuries already, and its history, as well as its motives, would be deserving of a separate video at some point. There's also the fact that media influence has grown to a point that it has moved on from being a mere enabler to being a full-fledged political player of its own. But that again is something we should discuss another time. As stated, the main challenge for the media lies in maintaining a balance of opinions that keeps society reliably divided, while at the same time enabling the ruling class to get on with ruling. That means in turn that we can use the views propagated by the media as a negative indicator of where society would be heading if it weren't for their influence. So if the media leans ever more into a certain political direction, it's an indicator that society is leaning in the opposite direction, or at least trying to hold its ground steadily. The heavier the lean, the greater the tension, which of course can also lead to a breaking point at which either the media or society give in. And we suddenly end up with a unified, monolithic opinion which would quite likely reside at one of the radical ends of the spectrum. Last but not least, there is another alternative to break that tension, and that is revolution. That, however, usually means a descent into chaos and is by far the worst solution. Therefore, the only way to keep this balance is if the ruling class represents neither of the interests of those polar opposites, which means in turn that it is the only compromise that represents the interests of all of society. This system is the neutral middle ground, the only way a society without unified direction and will can be organized without descending into revolutionary chaos. When talking about ruling classes, that usually includes banks, companies, lobbies, and nowadays also NGOs with vested interests. The enablers, however, consist of the media, politicians, the press, as well as celebrities and artists that fulfill a politically representative function, as I described it previously in my Artists and Politics video. Naturally, all these enablers are heavily intertwined, while at the same time the players with vested interests usually operate from the background. And this has also nothing to do with a conspiracy theory either. It's a matter of fact that there are plenty of entities that influence our politics more than it is befitting of a so-called democracy. When we take a look at either the left or right wing in our society, then we can see a state in which there are huge barriers preventing us from even trying to reach out and discuss the matters at hand. On both ends of the spectrum, we find people declaring that it makes no sense to discuss matters with the person on the other end of the spectrum. And by now, I am convinced that both sides have a legitimate feeling of being on the oppressed end of the spectrum. From that departure point, it could be discussed how legitimate those feelings are, but we need to embrace every single one of those people, trying to reach out and form a dialogue, even if we disagree with their stances, and even if we think they are still too biased to really listen to our concerns. Closing that gap isn't a matter of snapping your finger and it's there. It takes time and especially practice to form a dialogue and understand what the good intentions behind each of our endeavors are. It is also not something we can leave up to the ruling classes or their enablers, as they lack often not only the motivation, but also the creativity and vitality to come up with this unity for us. It is our job to overcome and force them to acknowledge that we aren't going to be divided and ruled any further. Based on all that, it seems a rather run-of-the-mill case of explaining divide and rule. The enablers are sowing distrust, the government isn't to be trusted, as they only represent the interests of banks, lobbies, and some few rich guys. At least, that bit is probably something many people would agree on and which could even be a dangerous foundation for a majority opinion. But it's not that simple. As I said in the beginning, I've been trying to force myself to consider the other point of view of every argument. It is easy, but dangerous to assume that the ruling classes are just a misanthropic collection of powerful people that like to play with the little man like pawns. There might be an element of this in some people, but certainly not all of them. Especially, however, that would not be a very efficient means of ruling, as you are unnecessarily putting your rule at risk due to the ever-rising discontent in society. Wouldn't it be a lot easier to direct the enablers in a direction that creates majority support for whatever you want to do? Now, it's not like that isn't an option, and in fact, there are certainly attempts at trying to shift public opinion into a direction that could create a lasting majority. But the prerequisites aren't in place yet. The degree to which a society is driven by a unified idea, or in turn is heavily divided, influences the amount and type of divide and rule we're seeing. In the beginnings of the old Egyptian kingdom, most everyone in Egyptian society seemed to be on board with the system in place, as the structural benefits for everybody were sufficient to justify the enormous disparity in privilege between ordinary people and the pharaoh. In times like that, divide and rule is mostly a matter of keeping the central bureaucracy in line. But as societies prosper, needs and expectations shift, and a larger degree of divide and rule is necessary to keep order intact. In times like that, the unified goal of a society becomes less clear, as contrasting ideas and goals start to pop up and demand their own right. The stronger these contrasting ideas get, the more the concept of divide and rule spreads into society. The final state of this can be found in a culture in decline, when the core values and ideas of a society have become increasingly meaningless to people, and where moral relativism reigns supreme. A civilization on the rise is always defined by a core idea that unites the people of that civilization under a cause that leads them to almost miraculous achievements. Those are only possible because a vast majority of society is willing to accept the necessity of this core value so it can push beyond its former limits and achieve more than otherwise imaginable. Even the counter-reaction to this core value, which is also an inherent part of each civilization, usually unites people under a common goal. In our Western civilization, that would be the Enlightenment, as a reaction to Christianity. But towards the end of its life cycle, in the so-called barbaric period, if you will, none of those two ideas have enough pull to unite all people under its banner, and so the various ideals, old and new, drift loosely and exist next to each other, waiting for a new idea to form that once again rises up and gives a civilization a common goal. Obviously, these ideas about cultural cycles need to be discussed in detail another time, but for now we can say that in times of decline, chaos lurks around every corner. And it is not unreasonable to see this mirrored in the almost hysterical view of the world many people have adopted. Conservatives mourn the loss of religion and nation-state, and to a degree rightfully so. Others are sharing doomsday prophecies with regards to climate change, or are panicking about any sort of national sentiment. These feelings, presuming that they are honestly felt, are all an expression of the insecurity of a society that cannot perceive a common goal going forward. This results in a society at the brink of chaos, and whenever chaos replaced order, the results would shake the world in its foundations for centuries to come. Under such circumstances, aren't we to prefer illegitimate order over chaos? Do we really want to gamble on the delusion that this time the revolution is going to work out fine? I would strongly advise against it, and history seems to agree with me. As such, a minority rule that uses the age-old method of dividing and ruling might be the best deal we can get at a time when no clear unity is yet in sight. The division process then consists more of balancing an already existing division than in breaking up any sort of unity. It might be the only thing that keeps us from descending into a world of true barbarism and brutality, like we haven't seen it since the end of the Roman Empire. So, where does that leave us, practically speaking? Does it mean that we should just shut up and be content with a minority rule that doesn't actually represent what it's supposed to represent according to its democratic label? No, of course not. First off, we need to get a clear view of where we're standing as a society. We need to address the fact that not only has the transcendent idea of the Occidental culture lost its unifying capability, so has also the rational counter-reaction of the Enlightenment. As can be witnessed also in many of the arts from the early 20th century onwards, the consensus has exploded and left us with either strict denial of tradition or a floating collection of loose fragments of cultural ideas, incapable yet of forming a new coherent structure. The question of whether we are at the end of a cultural cycle is a complicated one. And while I did touch upon it, it is a topic deserving of separate discussion another time. But even if you don't agree with the assumption that we are living at the end of a cultural cycle, yes, even if you don't even believe that Western culture is at a point of crisis, and even if you don't even believe in the idea of a coherent Western culture, you still need to answer the question how any society can move forward in a state of grave division, which is unfortunately a state we're in that cannot simply be reasoned away. I do, however, believe that each and every one of us can help that process, using the principles of overcoming one's own point of view as laid out in my negation of the negation video, to see the good intention in the other. We all know that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but at least there aren't outright evil intentions, and that's a starting point. We have to move closer to each other to understand that we will only be able to work out things together, or have the whole thing end in a bloodbath. If you're on the right side of the spectrum, you might have to consider that preserving a status quo from just a few decades back isn't a solution to historical challenges. And if you're on the left side of the spectrum, you might have to consider that a utopian idea might not only be unrealistic, but might even go against the very nature of humans. And trying to change that has led to some of the greatest horrors in human history. Only by engaging with each other respectfully and assuming a positive stance towards each other's opinions can we hope to overcome that division and possibly, at some point in the future, render governance by divide and rule obsolete, or at least reduce it and go forward hand in hand once again towards a society that a considerable majority of people can sign up for. Until then, we might have to live with a minority rule that keeps us afloat, but that doesn't mean we have to give in to further escalation of the division. So go out, talk to someone out of your bubble. Don't be a pushover, but keep an open mind. And don't assume that the other has evil intentions to start off with. Also, don't waste your energy on debates that have no hope of being fruitful. You can't convince somebody to open up to this discourse. That first step everyone has to make for themselves. Thanks for watching, and as always, please leave a like, a comment, and you can subscribe by clicking on the logo below me. Next to me, you'll find 2 other videos, most likely a recent one and my Building Blocks of Society playlist. If you're watching on BitChute, none of that works anyway, but you'll know that. Thanks, and see you soon in my next video.